Beneath the dust of forgotten cemeteries and the whispers of ruined farmhouses lies a story that was never meant to surface. Imagine a man who did not simply marry within his family once, but twice over, binding himself to a woman who was both his sister and his niece at the same time. To most of us, this sounds impossible, grotesque, something that could never have happened in the daylight of real history. But it did. It happened in America, and the records were quietly shelved away, buried under genealogies so tangled that even the churches who baptized their children refused to speak of it afterward. Tonight, we reopen that book. Tonight, we peel back the silence. The marriage at the center of this tale was not one born out of love as we would define it. It was a ritual of blood, a sealing of lineage in which flesh was sacrificed to the preservation of a name. In the early years of the American frontier, families carved out their survival by clinging tightly to themselves. Strangers were threats. Outsiders were dangers. And so, generation after generation, cousins wed cousins, siblings married into the branches they were never meant to touch, until the tree began to rot from its own roots. The man, let us call him Samuel, grew up knowing that his world extended no farther than the valley in which his family had settled. He worked the same soil his grandfather had bled into, and when it came time to choose a wife, there was no selection. There was only arrangement. His bride was Anna. She was his blood twice over, the daughter of his father's affair with his mother's sister, his sister by birth, and his niece by scandal. Their faces were mirrors of one another, marked by the subtle deformities that come when blood circles back upon itself. Neighbors whispered, but no one interfered. To speak against it would be to risk exile from the only community that offered protection. In the candlelit silence of their wedding, the union was sealed, not with celebration, but with resignation. There were no guests, no joy, only the quiet acknowledgement that the family line had devoured itself once more. And yet, from this union, children were born, children who bore not just the weight of their ancestors' sins, but the visible proof of them etched into their faces. This is where the story begins. A marriage that should never have existed, a family bound not by choice, but by a compulsion to repeat the mistakes of their blood. And once you see how deep this wound goes, you may never look at family the same way again. Samuel and Anna's home stood on the edge of the valley, a sagging structure of wood and stone that seemed to bend beneath the weight of its own history. Those who passed by spoke of the stillness around it, as though the land itself recoiled from what it sheltered. Inside, the air was heavy with silence, punctured only by the creak of floorboards and the faint rasp of their voices. There was no music, no laughter, only the solemn routine of survival. But beneath the surface, something darker lingered, the knowledge that their bloodline had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. Samuel carried himself with the stern resolve of a man who knew no other life. His face, worn by labor and years of quiet shame, bore the mark of inheritance. His jaw was uneven, his brow too heavy, his eyes set slightly askew, like puzzle pieces forced to fit where they did not belong. Anna's features reflected his, softened perhaps, but unmistakably cut from the same flawed stone. When they walked side by side, it was like seeing the same face twice, divided only by gender. The villagers noticed, though they never dared to speak it aloud. Their children came quickly. The first boy was born pale and frail, his breath thin as if the air itself resisted entering his lungs. He survived, but with a cough that never left him. The second child, a girl, bore eyes that wandered in opposite directions, never quite meeting the world head-on. By the third birth, even Samuel could no longer ignore the truth written in their flesh. The family's insistence on binding itself together had twisted the very fabric of their blood. Yet instead of turning away, the family doubled down. It was as though the shame drove them deeper into secrecy, convincing them that the only way to protect themselves was to tighten their circle even further. To outsiders, Samuel spoke of legacy, of preserving tradition, but behind closed doors it was fear that ruled him, the fear of outsiders discovering the truth, of neighbors drawing lines of disgust and exile. The home became not just a dwelling but a prison of silence. Anna, trapped between her role as sister, niece, and wife, carried her burden with a stoic face, but those who saw her eyes knew she had been hollowed out by it. In her quiet moments, she lingered near the window, staring into the woods as though the trees held a freedom she would never touch. But freedom had long since been traded away for secrecy, and what remained was a family shackled by blood. The valley itself seemed to hold their secret, as though the soil had absorbed generations of whispers and shame. Neighbors lived near enough to sense what was happening, yet far enough to pretend ignorance. In rural America, silence was often the price of peace. Families like Samuel's thrived in the blind spots, those pockets of land where churches hesitated to interfere, where county records were little more than half-inked names in crumbling ledgers, and so the truth was hidden, not just by those who lived it, but by the very institutions that should have stopped it. But history has a way of leaving fingerprints. In this case, it was the children who bore them. Their faces carried the evidence that could not be erased. Strangers who saw them at market, or in the rare moments when the family appeared in town, felt an unease they could not name. The children's eyes seemed to follow too slowly, their limbs slightly off in proportion, their skin marked with pallor that spoke of weakness within. People whispered words like touched or feeble-minded, never daring to confront the reality directly. Samuel's father had begun the cycle, blurring the lines of kinship until blood ties became knots impossible to untangle. Samuel's marriage to Anna was the consequence of years of unspoken violations, each hidden beneath a layer of silence. To outsiders, it appeared as though this was merely one family's eccentricity, but in truth, it was the culmination of generations. What haunts us now is not only the deformities etched in bone and face, but the psychology behind it. Imagine being born into such a family, where the words brother, sister, cousin, and wife meant little more than roles to be assigned as needed. Identity itself collapsed under the weight of secrecy. Children grew without the comfort of clear boundaries. Mothers and aunts blurred together. Fathers and uncles became indistinguishable. And into that fog of kinship, Samuel stepped willingly, binding himself to Anna, not simply out of duty, but out of a belief that there was no alternative. By the time the church began to ask questions, it was already too late. Generations of damage had been done. The priest who baptized their children recorded the names with a steady hand, but a shaking mind. Later, he would write in his journal that he had felt as though he was staring into the face of original sin itself, not the kind spoken of in sermons, but something older, more primal, something that had lived in the blood long before the valley was ever settled. The tragedy of Samuel and Anna's union was not confined to the walls of their home. It rippled outward, creeping into the minds of those who witnessed it, staining the valley with a kind of quiet dread. People began to avoid the family, not openly, but in subtle ways. A sudden silence when they entered a room, a refusal to share tools or bread, averted eyes at the market. The family's name became less a lineage and more a warning, whispered among children as though it carried a curse. Yet within their home, life went on with grim persistence. Samuel plowed the fields, his body bent and hardened by labor, his silence growing heavier with each year. Anna moved through the house like a shadow, her expression fixed in that distant gaze, her voice rarely rising above a whisper. Their children played, but even their laughter carried an uncanny edge, as if joy itself had been bent and broken by the blood that birthed them. The neighbors may not have spoken openly, but they felt it. This was not an ordinary family, but one marked by the unnatural weight of its own choices. By the fourth child, the signs were undeniable. The boy was born with limbs twisted, his cries weak and short-lived. He survived only weeks. The family buried him in the orchard, not in the churchyard, as though even in death he could not be placed among the innocent. This act of quiet exclusion sealed the family's fate in the eyes of the community. Whispers became certainty, certainty became fear, and fear, in time, became disgust. But still, the cycle did not break. Instead, it tightened. Samuel clung more fiercely to Anna, as if their bond, no matter how perverse, was the only shield against a world that rejected them. He told himself it was tradition, legacy, destiny. Yet the truth was simpler. Shame had closed every door, until the only path left was the one leading deeper into ruin. Anna, meanwhile, withdrew further into silence. She began to wander the house at night, candle in hand, murmuring to herself words no one could understand. Some said she prayed, others whispered she spoke to the child buried beneath the orchard. Her body weakened, her frame grew thin, but Samuel never released her from her role. She was his wife, his sister, his blood, and in his mind, that bond was unbreakable. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The family's story began to leak beyond the valley, carried not by records or official voices, but by gossip, small poisoned drops of truth that slipped into the wider world. A traveling merchant spoke of the children with faces that mirrored one another too closely, of a wife whose eyes seemed more like a sister's reflection than a bride's. Another man passing through swore he had seen Samuel watching him from the field, his gaze dark and unblinking, as though daring him to name aloud the secret everyone else buried in whispers. For years no one dared intervene, but time erodes silence. One winter, a county official came to the valley, tasked with updating census records. When he entered Samuel's home, he found himself staring into a lineage that defied comprehension. Brother and sister listed as man and wife, children whose parentage could not be explained without drawing lines that crossed back upon themselves. The official did not confront them. Instead, he wrote the names carefully, folded the record, and left in silence. Later, in the margins of his ledger, he scrawled one note: "This should never be." The children grew, and with them the weight of their heritage. Some tried to escape, wandering beyond the valley in search of work or freedom. But even there, they carried the mark of their blood. Strangers sensed something off in their features, in their mannerisms, in the way their eyes lingered too long, or their words slipped into odd cadences. They could not leave behind what had been carved into them. The valley followed wherever they went. By the late 1800s, whispers of the family had become legend. Locals called them cursed, a house doomed by the sin of blood turned inward. Farmers avoided the road that passed their home at night, swearing they heard strange cries drifting from the orchard where the small grave lay. Children dared one another to run past the house without looking in the windows, fearing what faces might stare back. The truth of Samuel and Anna's marriage was no longer just history. It had become folklore, the kind of story mothers told their children to keep them away from temptation. And yet, hidden in the county archives, their names remain, faded ink, uneven letters, the record of a bond that should never have been. It is there, waiting for anyone brave enough to trace the lines of kinship and uncover the depth of the valley's darkest secret. But most who stumble upon it close the book quickly, as though the story itself could stain their hands. As Samuel and Anna aged, the weight of their choices settled into their bodies like a sickness. Samuel's once strong frame stooped lower each year, his hands shaking from more than just labor. His eyes, clouded and uneven, carried the haunted look of a man who had bound himself to something he could never escape. Anna, frail and withdrawn, seemed less alive than remembered, her presence more ghost than flesh. Those who caught glimpses of her swore she drifted through the house in silence, her face lit by some inner grief no words could capture. Their children, those who survived, grew into adults marked by the inheritance of secrecy. Some bore the physical signs more heavily than others: crooked spines, misshapen jaws, minds clouded by confusion. Others seemed nearly untouched, and yet even they could not outrun the bloodline. For how could one form a life free of corruption when their very identity had been built upon it? Marriage prospects were few, and when unions did occur, they were often within the same tangle of kinship. The cycle spun onward, grinding bone against bone, erasing the possibility of fresh beginnings. The valley itself began to change. Families who once tolerated the whispers now moved away, seeking cleaner soil, leaving behind empty homes that rotted into the earth. What had once been a thriving community decayed into a patchwork of silence, with Samuel's household at its hollow center. The old farmhouse sagged under the burden of generations, its windows dark, its doors warped and swollen like lips refusing to speak. Travelers passing through no longer even slowed their horses. The place had become a landmark of dread, a shadow carved into the land itself. By the time death finally claimed Samuel and Anna, there were no mourners, no procession. Their graves were shallow, dug by their own blood, their names barely marked. No church bell rang. No sermon was spoken. They left behind only their children, who in turn carried the curse further, repeating the pattern like a wound that never healed. This is the true horror, not the act of one marriage, but the echo it created stretching across time like a stain that could not be washed away. Samuel and Anna did not merely ruin themselves. They infected their descendants with a legacy so twisted that even generations later, their faces bore the scars of choices made in secrecy and silence. Today, their story sits buried in half-forgotten archives, hidden between yellowed pages and brittle ink. Yet, if you search carefully, you can still trace the outlines of what happened. The census records with names that shouldn't be joined. The church registers where the priest's handwriting falters, as though his hand resisted putting such unions into words. The rumors etched in local newspapers, never explicit but always circling the same shadow. And if you walk the valley itself, what remains of the farmhouse still leans against the earth, its timbers split and groaning, its windows black as sockets in a skull. Time has not erased it, time has only buried it deeper. But the haunting part is not that it happened then, it is that stories like theirs are not singular. In the dark corners of America's past, this pattern repeated more than anyone dares to admit. Families locked away in isolation, names erased by shame, children born into a world where love and duty were twisted into something unrecognizable. The archives hold more than one Samuel, more than one Anna. They hold dozens, hundreds, and for every story that surfaces, countless more remain unspoken, sealed behind doors that will never open. To hear their story is to confront a truth most cannot face, that beneath the proud mythology of the American frontier, there are fractures, lines of rot that run through the soil and the blood of its people. We prefer the legends of strength, of independence, of survival against all odds. But survival has a darker side. It can breed desperation, it can breed silence, and sometimes it can breed the most unholy of bonds. So when you think of Samuel and Anna, when you picture the man who married his sister twice over, binding himself to blood until his children bore the scars, remember that this is not just their tragedy. It is a window into a larger horror, a reflection of how easily secrecy and shame can twist families into prisons. Their graves may lie forgotten, their names reduced to ink fading in a county ledger, but the echo remains. It lingers in the silence of valleys across this country, in the shadows of houses that crumble without witnesses, in the memories we dare not write down. And if you ever find yourself walking those woods at night, and you hear the sound of a woman's whisper drifting from an abandoned house, ask yourself this: is it the voice of the past calling out, or the bloodline itself refusing to die?